7 right now. Lyndon LaRouche Jr. is no newcomer to politics. He's run for president 3 times, twice as a Democrat. Each time he's lost overwhelmingly. But he's not deterred by that. He's already announced he's going to run again in 1988.
Foreign policy. We're idiots. We're criminals in foreign policy.
This is the way LaRouche talks. He has very active followers, too. They distribute his literature at a number of airports.
We worked with Lyndon LaRouche. And I'm sorry, I don't like Mr. LaRouche. I read about him. Sorry, okay.
Recently, LaRouche followers gained a lot of new attention. 2 of them won nomination for statewide office in Illinois as Democrats.
The LaRouche method is the method of General Patton. It is the method of General MacArthur. My method is the method of Joan of Arc.
Here's some of what LaRouche stands for. He's for the Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars program, as it's called. He's for nuclear energy. He's for international monetary reform. He supports an all-out war on drugs and has accused bankers and the Queen of England of being drug pushers. He wants all Americans to be tested for AIDS and would quarantine those who test positive. While some of these are considered standard political views, he is not a standard political candidate. We'll talk with Mr. LaRouche after this, 11 minutes after 7 right now. 13 minutes after 7. Lyndon LaRouche Jr. joins us now live from our studio in Washington. Good morning, Mr. LaRouche.
Good morning, David.
Morning. Let's start off with something that Mr. LaRouche said recently on ABC's Nightline. He told Ted Koppel, the host of the program, this about wanting to be President of the United States.
You still want to be?
Well, I don't particularly want to be. I think I have to be, unless somebody comes along who I say, okay, let him have it. He's qualified.
All right. Why do you have to be president, Mr. LaRouche?
We're facing, you're not probably seeing it coming out publicly, but we're facing the greatest crisis on several issues in our nation's history. We're standing months away from a potential blowout of a banking system. We have a major economic crisis in terms of its effects on ordinary people in this country. We have a major foreign policy crisis, especially in the area of debt. We have a Middle East crisis. We have an Africa crisis, and we have an increasing strategic military problem. All these crises, which have been building up over the past 20 years, have to be faced, and the time of reckoning has come. Reagan, I think, has been a better president than his predecessors, but there are some very bad failures there, and he, too, has ducked and failed to face the issues.
All right, let's assume for a moment that we'll take at face value your statement that these are all the kind of crises you say, although there are those who would disagree with you. Why would you do a better job of solving those crises than, let's say, Gary Hart or Mario Cuomo or others in the Democratic Party who are mentioned as possible presidents?
I don't know of anybody who's indicated as a presidential candidate in the Democratic Party who has any competence whatsoever for dealing with any of these issues. They just simply are on
what are your credentials if they don't have credentials?
Well,
and they, on the surface of it, seem to have credentials and you don't. What are yours that they don't have?
Well, I'm an economist. I'm probably the best one living today in terms of performance. I understand the issues. I've dealt with foreign governments, particularly in the developing sector. I'm very close to many of them. I've consulted with all of them. I know what they want. I know what they're willing to do. I also know what some forces in Europe are willing to do. And therefore, when it comes to foreign agreements, I know how to get them. There are people in foreign governments, if I were president, who would come to Washington, and I guarantee you, within a matter of 48 to 72 hours, we'd have agreements that would change the world.
What leaders and what kind of agreements?
For example, the non-aligned nations, or most of the nations of Africa, most of the nations of South America, a lot of the nations of Southeast Asia, Japan, and forces in Europe, who, if I were president of the United States, I guarantee you, in 48 to 72 hours, of my being president, we would have fundamental changes in monetary policy, in strategic policy, in trade policy, and these would be very beneficial to the United States. Without these agreements with foreigners, we really cannot solve the full spectrum of problems we have today.
If you were calling the shots in the Middle East right now, what would you change, if anything, regarding our policy toward Israel?
I would have a complete endorsement and full U.S. support, political support, for what Prime Minister Shimon Peres has called for as a new Marshall Plan for both the Arab countries and Israel in the Middle East. Without that kind of policy, which I've been pushing for 10 years, and Peres has been pushing it for a comparable period of time. I've talked to him, or at least I've written to him. We've had correspondence back and forth, and correspondence and communication with some of the people close to him on this issue. I know what he's intending. It's right. It's the only solution. We ought to back Peres fully.
All right. As you know, to get anything done as president, you need a lot of support in the political community in Washington to get your agenda on stream. You have, to say the least, insulted a lot of people in Washington. You have a lot of mainstream people in Washington who think you're either an extremist or crazy or nuts. How would you, if you're president, get the kind of support you need to make anything happen?
Well, there's some good fellows up there who wouldn't admit it right now. But these fellows are opportunist. I don't know if that's the right word to use, but I tell you, if I'm ahead, they're my friends. If I'm not ahead, they'll go with the other fellow.
All right, you said you're a target for assassination. Specifically, who's out to get you and why?
Well, it comes from the Soviet KGB, and to a secondary degree, somewhat independently of the KGB, some drug pushers. That's the only problem I know of.
All right, you said that you're quoted as saying that Henry Kissinger, quote, has run operations against you that involve assassination threats and assassination potentialities, unquote. What evidence do you have of that would hold up in a court of law?
Oh, a lot of it. But the problem is Kissinger began running operations against me, according to federal records, about 1974.
But what's your evidence? Quote some evidence, because if you don't have the evidence, then...
Well, yeah, we have, for example, federal information releases.
Why not produce it publicly?
Oh,
if you can't produce it publicly...
Oh, they've been produced. They've been produced in court and elsewhere. There's no... the news media may not care to report on these things when they're produced, but they've been produced. It's not my fault, it's the news media's.
How much else is the fault of the news media where you're concerned? To what extent do they represent you correctly or incorrectly?
I've looked at 6,500, or I've sampled 6,500 pieces of coverage of me in print media around the country during a period of approximately the past 30 days. In most cases, there was very little coverage of anything I actually said, did, or stand for. But there was a tremendous amount of repeat of wild, fictitious, sometimes outright lying reports emanating and traceable to the drug lobby, Dennis King and company. So the news media in this country, in their coverage of me, has not given the American people, with a few exceptions, has not given the American people a direct representation of anything I stand for. What's been peddled is a bunch of lies. And, for example, AP recently, an AP reporter was caught in assisting an extortion operation against William Welch, against my organization and supporters.
Let's look at a piece of tape. You spoke to the National Press Club last month, and here's what you said to an NBC reporter.
I'm saying, look, you guys are a bunch of liars. How can I talk with a drug pusher like you? Nycannon.
Sir, go ahead.
That was Mark Nycannon. He is a drug pusher. He's an NBC employee. He works closely with Dennis King, with Chip Burley, and with the drug lobby generally.
What's your evidence, Mr. LaRouche? Because if you ain't got the goods in writing that'll hold up in court, then you can be sued for slander, and why shouldn't you be?
Well, the goods have been presented in court on Nycannon.
But what about this reporter at NBC?
That's Nycannon, NBC.
Oh,
he's a drug pusher. Before he went to work for NBC in Chicago, NBC News in Chicago, he was a drug lobbyist scribbler from the Southwest, writing attacks on police for making drug busts on the border. And then he went to Chicago. In 1982, he was involved together with the drug lobby, Chip Burley, that is John Foster Chip Burley, in Chicago, running a dirty operation against anti-drug operations in Chicago. Then in 1984, he was part of a team which worked again with the drug lobby, Dennis King, Chip Burley et al., to run another scam against me. So the guy has a track record for his entire adult life, pulling back his record. His entire professional life, he has been associated with drug-pushing operations.
Mr. LaRouche, you have called the Queen of England a drug pusher and said that she is morally responsible as the head of the Commonwealth for the acts of Commonwealth citizens. To what extent, therefore, is Ronald Reagan also responsible for acts of American citizens?
No, that's the subject of a 600-odd page book. It's not a quip, and it's thoroughly documented in the book, Doping. The Queen of England, the British government, since 1787, has officially, by law, authorized narcotics trafficking by its banking system. That is the case today. We have laws against that.
All right, so Ronald Reagan is not responsible for the acts of American citizens in the same manner?
No, the Queen of England is wittingly responsible for the continuation of the drug traffic by her subjects.
Mr. LaRouche, we're out of time. Thank you. Good to have you with us this morning. Thank you.
Good to see you, Dave.
And we'll be back in just a moment, 22 after.